So welcome Jason Birch to Keen on Yoga. I don't know what to call this. It'll probably be a podcast and it's a YouTube chat. Jason is a senior research fellow. I think you call it a fellow. It's an old-fashioned English word for a researcher, I suppose, or a professor at SOAS. SOAS is the School of Oriental and African Studies in London, UK. And he's also got he's currently working on a light on Hatha Project, which is about the yoga Pradipika, particularly the yoga Pradipika of Swapmarama, I think, and that I don't know how long that's in completion or when you'll get the results of that.
In another year and a half, it finishes. Yeah, so it's been going for a year and a half. It started at the beginning of 2021, sorry, and it will finish at the end of next year.
It sounds like a lot of work. And a lot of writing and reading and editing.
It is, because we've accessed so many manuscripts of the Haṭhapradīpikā. So the text itself is not that long. It's maybe 400 to 500 verses, depending on the version that you're looking at. But there's over 200 manuscripts in Indian libraries, as well as libraries in Europe and other parts of South Asia. So we spent the first year accessing as many of those as we could remotely, because travel wasn't possible in 2021, and we were surprised to get hold of 150 or so manuscripts, which we've looked at to date. So much of our time has actually gone into trying to work out how to deal with so much manuscript material, because you can't, for practical reasons, it's just too much labour to try and collate so much manuscript material. And the other consideration is that it's not helpful in many instances to collate so much material, because it will produce a critical edition with far too much unimportant information in it. So the important information will get lost or will be very hard for the reader to see. So a lot of our discussion and work so far has focused on how to identify the most important witnesses, so that we can sort of, out of the 150 manuscripts that we have, say, these are the 20 or 30 that are most important for establishing the text, and then, of course, translating it after that. And we've sort of decided on a method for doing that. We've I think done the hard work, and we've identified 9 versions of the text, and a few of those versions are not so important, and in fact it just so happens that the version of the text that most people are familiar with today through the printed editions is based on a rather recent commentary, the Jyotsna by Brahmananda, and he lived in the 19th century, and it seemed that when various scholars and publishing houses, various pundits in the late 19th, early 20th century decided to print a copy of the Haṭhapradīpikā, that they used his version of the text, but basically because they also used his commentary to understand it. And it is a fairly elementary level commentary. It glosses a lot of the words and explains the basics. So it was useful, I imagine, for pundits and publishers who were not necessarily familiar with the literature on Hatha Yoga. But the thing is, of course, he's writing, Brahmananda's writing in the 19th century, and he had a particular agenda behind his commentary. He was sort of trying to interpret the text from a more Vedantic point of view. So he chose a version of the text that was suitable for that, and perhaps even made some decisions about which verses to include and exclude. So when we go back to older manuscripts, we see in a lot of cases different structure. I mean, the basic structure of the text is 4 chapters. The first is on asana, the second pranayama with the shat karma as a type of preliminary practice to the kumbhakas, the 8 kumbhakas that are taught in the 2nd chapter. Mudra is the topic of the 3rd, and then the 4th is on Raja Yoga. And the overarching structure or scheme is that Hatha Yoga, the practice of the first 3 chapters, is the means to achieving Raja Yoga, which is the goal of Hatha, and it's basically the practice of samadhi, a profound state of meditation that is necessary for achieving liberation from worldly existence, suffering, pain, all the sorts of things that we try to escape.
Avoid?
Yeah, avoid,
Yeah.
reduce, lessen.
Yeah, at least lessen. What? So I notice in a lot of your work, there's a lot of it's very dense, often in comparative texts, and I suppose my original question was, why is that? I mean, it might sound really stupid, but why is that such a focus? And then you kind of answered it in a way by saying, well, there's huge differentiations between the copies of these texts around, right? You know, like, so they might be massively, depending on who has got his hands on what, his or her, or their hands on what. You know, what would come across as the Yoga Shastra, Patanjali Shastra, or the Pradipika might be massively different, right? Is that correct?
Absolutely. There are different versions of the text that are created over time. In some cases, it's not particularly deliberate. What can happen is that marginal notes and comments that someone makes on a manuscript slowly get absorbed into the main text. So someone could be reading the text, and there could be certain verses that are relevant to the material that they're reading that they write in the margin for their own use, their own benefit. And then someone comes along and decides to do a new copy of that manuscript, and then some of the verses that are in the margin, that are not always easy to distinguish the main part of the text from the margin, some of those suddenly find their way into the text. And so, generally speaking, over time, Sanskrit texts with a manuscript transmission start to grow in size. They start to get larger. And people can also deliberately add material. So if they feel that there's not enough verses on Khichari Mudra, for example, and they know some really helpful, in their opinion, really helpful verses from somewhere else, they just might put them into the text when they're copying out a manuscript. And then likewise, in other cases, some parts of the text get left out or omitted deliberately. So they can be left out just by a scribe whose eye skips from one point to another unknowingly, and so he misses some material out, and so you're reading the manuscript, and if you know the text, you might be sort of going from one verse to another, one page to another, and all of a sudden there's something missing, and you're wondering where it's gone, and it's just because a scribe has skipped over it. And then in other cases, scribes can deliberately omit material if they don't think it's appropriate, and that happened with the Haṭhapradīpikā in the 3rd chapter on Vadroli Mudra, this mudra that involves absorbing semen back up through the urethra, usually after sexual intercourse.
We kind of did a whole podcast with Jim on that.
Oh, okay, yes.
If people want to listen to that, we've kind of spoken up for about an hour almost in the end.
Well, it's a very involved.
It's an interesting subject. Yeah.
For those who've listened to that podcast, they'll realise that there were some sort of orthodox groups of within Indian society who would have found that material distasteful or basically would have gone against their notions of purity and propriety and so forth. So this is probably why the Vadroli section is omitted from some manuscripts. And in fact, we do get a scribal comment saying that the practice was omitted because it was not considered to be a universal practice. And then in other cases, that content on Vadroli was omitted and then added as a 5th chapter to the text. Sort of like an appendix. So so for anybody who might be offended by Vadroli Mudra, they just read chapters 1 to 4, and then for anybody who really wants that material, it's a separate 5th chapter. So these types of changes to Sanskrit texts happen over the centuries, so much so that sometimes the original version of the text is lost, or we as readers or editors are are wondering what it was. How large was the original text? Was Vadroli in the original text, or was it added at a later time? All these are legitimate questions when you start to see different versions of the text appearing in different manuscripts. So a critical edition. So if you look at the printed editions that were published at the end of the 19th or early 20th century, you just think there's one version of the text and that's it. It's a sort of a fixed thing. And when you read the translation, you think, well, this is what Svatmarama, the author of the Haṭhapradīpikā, was writing in the 15th century. This is what he intended and how he was thinking. I think what we're trying to do as academics and scholars is we're trying to reveal to a wider audience that actually the text has been many different things to different people. There's been different versions of the text, different readings within the verses, and we really want to produce an edition that has all of that information, relevant information in there, so that a really interested reader can go into the edition and see all of the differences and understand that. So that's our main aim with a critical edition, is to show the different versions of the text. Now, it's often not easy to do with a printed edition because you're restricted by what a book can do. And this is where digital editions are starting to take over. And for the Light on Hatha project, we are working to produce a digital edition. Yeah. And the beauty with digital editions is that you can change the structure of the text. You can present different versions of the text just with the click of a button. And you can also supply a lot of notes and annotations, variant readings and so forth, quite easily without it overwhelming the reader. Because again, with a printed edition, often if you try to put all of that information on the page, then there might be just sort of one verse at the top of the page, and then the rest is just footnotes. And for the average reader, footnotes and all of that tends to sort of...
small writing. I found that a little bit, I have to say, with Roots of Yoga. It was like, there was a lot of footnotes there, and probably I didn't read half of the book because I just didn't read a lot of the footnotes, if I'm honest. Sorry, Jess.
Well, I was just going to say, as academics, we love footnotes because it sort of enables us to provide that information that will otherwise clog up the main part of the text. If we tried to sort of... And there has been a sort of a trend within particularly American scholarship to write a scholarly book without footnotes and include all the information. But often what happens then is they end up leaving out a lot of information because it makes the main part of the text so complicated that nobody, would read that. Whereas if you're working with a sort of main text footnote format, you can strive to keep the main text simple to some extent. Just put the basic arguments and information up there, and if somebody sort of reads that and says, well, hang on a minute, what about, the writers just said Svatmarama lived in the 15th century, but what about this other book that says that he lived in the 17th century? Well, you could address that in footnote. You could say, the evidence suggests Svatmarama lived in the 15th century because of X, Y, and Z. The proposal that he lived in the 17th century is unfounded because of X, Y, and Z. So you can have those provide that sort of information for the reader who might be wanting, more detail.
But for the simpleton, for the one that doesn't, let's get back maybe now from that. It's super interesting, land of comparative text and study. And I'm assuming you're kind of reading these ancient texts and trying to figure out what stuff that's kind of like half wilted and half been eaten by ants, and you're reading the Sanskrit. It sounds like a crazy kind of project you're involved in. I actually probably have a lot of other questions on that, but what about the Pradipika then? People are interested in it. Our listenership is yoga asana based. Is this the first real point when yoga asana is kind of synthesized into a cohesive whole, and is it representative of the trends of asana before it, or is it really a kind of a sea change in terms of how asana is presented?
It's the first instance where asana is taught as an anga, an auxiliary of Hatha Yoga. So one of the reasons that we're able to edit the Haṭhapradīpikā now with more confidence than what we could have done in the past is that we've through the Hatha Yoga project, we spent a lot of time editing the earlier texts, the texts that Svatmarama, the author of the Haṭhapradīpikā, used to create his work. And that's the interesting thing about the Haṭhapradīpikā. It's a compendium, it's a sort of anthology. He takes bits and pieces from older material and cut and pastes it into a new format, and if you like, a new fourfold structure of Hatha Yoga. And one of those components, one of those elements is asana. Whereas in the earlier texts, asana really just figures more as a seated pose in which pranayama is done, and the emphasis is undoubtedly on kumbhaka with the practice of mudra, particularly the bandhas, the three bandhas that your audience would be familiar with. You know, the mula bandha, root lock, uddiyana in the abdomen, and then jalandhara bandha, the chin lock. And these were originally conceived as mechanisms which were used during breath retention. So that was the emphasis of early Hatha Yoga, these mudras, and then what we see in the Haṭhapradīpikā in the first chapter.
How far back does that go? Sorry. When did that start coming in?
Yeah, the earliest evidence we have is around the 11th, 12th century, with the Amrita Siddhi as a text, a Buddhist Vajrayana work. It doesn't teach Hatha Yoga, but it teaches these bandhas with kumbhakas. And then that becomes Hatha Yoga around the 12th century, when the material is appropriated by a Shaiva community that produce a text called the Amaraugha. And the Amaraugha teaches 4 types of yoga: mantra, laya, hatha, and Raja Yoga. Raja Yoga is the goal, and that's basically just a Shaiva interpretation of samadhi, meditation. In fact, it's defined as chittavritti rahita, which is very similar to Patanjali's definition, chittavritti nirodha, rahita just meaning without, so without mental activity. And the Hatha Yoga is the practice of the 3 main mudras, which is Mahamudra, Mahabandha, Mahaveda, and that results in Raja Yoga, basically because it brings about the internal resonance, the nada, that the yogi can then sort of focus his or her mind on and reach that profound state of meditation. So that's an early example, and it's a very basic skeletal type of practice, just 3 mudras in which 2 of the bandhas are practiced. And then over time more techniques are added, so you start to get a repertoire of 10 mudras. You start to get 4 kumbhakas. Kumbhakas are the types of breath retention. Bastra or bastrika, it has the rapid breathing followed by holding the breath. Ujjayi has the sort of rasping sound in the throat, followed by a breath retention with an exhalation through the left nostril. So there's sort of particular ways of holding the breath, and the bandhas are applied during the retention and also at the beginning of the exhalation, so that one can extend the exhalation for a longer period of time. And then what we see in the Haṭhapradīpikā is the sort of overarching blueprint for what became known as Hatha Yoga in the early modern period, and that was this sort of 4-fold system where you have asana, including non-seated asanas. So it's not just the seated postures that we see in earlier texts, such as Siddhasana and Padmasana, but it also includes Dhanurasana, the bow pose, and there's at least 7 non-seated poses: Mayurasana, Matsyendrasana.
Right. So previous to that, there's no mention of any kind of yoga postures apart from ones that you were seated to breathe and a kind of Janu Shirshasana, right, where they were doing the Mahamudra stuff, right, like a kind of a roughly kind of extended, one leg bent, one leg straight, kind of like chin in, bandhas engaged, but nothing other than that really. No standing stuff, no Yeah.
That's true in the context of Hatha Yoga. So in Hatha Yoga, it was pretty much just the mudras, bandhas, and some seated poses. There are examples of earlier yoga systems before the Haṭhapradīpikā was composed that had Mayurasana and Kukutasana. And these tended to be Vaishnava traditions that date back to around the 9th, 10th century. And they have these two poses often in discussions of an Ashtanga type of system. And, amongst asanas, there might be, say, 8 or 10 asanas that are taught. Most of them will be seated asanas, and then Mayurasana and Kukutasana would be included. So the Vasishta Samhita, the Yoga Yajnavalkya are two good examples of that. And they were source texts for Svatmarama when he produced the Haṭhapradīpikā, but neither of those texts teach Hatha Yoga. They just teach a Vaishnava version of Ashtanga. So,
do they say why they were using them?
Well, yes. So we can speculate. There are a few comments around the health benefits of those postures, even in the early period, that they're supposed to cure illnesses. So there are some specific comments in the Vasishta Samhita and the Yoga Yajnavalkya that asana cures all diseases. And there's a more general comment in an early text called the Vivekamartanda, which teaches a six-fold system, a Sharanga yoga. And there it says asana is for curing illnesses, pranayama for purification, pratyahara for another reason. I think it's for mental disturbances, and then samadhi, the final auxiliary, the final anga, is for liberation. So in general statements like that, asana is often referred to for curing illnesses. And illnesses are a problem in yoga because yoga relies on practice, abhyasa, and if you can't practice because you're sick, then you can't succeed in yoga. So diseases are a problem, and this is why, going back to, of course, the time of Patanjali, they're considered to be an obstacle. Which I think it's in the first chapter. There are various suggested practices to overcome them. It's the same in the medieval period. With the asanas and pranayama have lots of curative benefits. When we look at the complex asanas in the Haṭhapradīpikā, such as Matsyendrasana or Mayurasana, there are entire verses devoted to the benefits of those particular postures, and the benefits are usually fairly mundane, various diseases, specific diseases, and then you might say more exaggerated statements that they cure a whole group of diseases, all 20 kapha diseases.
Everything.
Yeah, or everything, as in the case of Padmasana or Siddhasana.
Yeah.
But there's also, some yogic types of effects as well, such as raising kundalini, which is one of the benefits of Matsyendrasana. So it goes beyond that, beyond just the mundane benefits. But certainly, it seems the emphasis of the complex asanas was to cure illnesses, and that, in my opinion, is probably why they were incorporated into systems of Hatha Yoga. When we look at earlier texts and their references to asanas, they often mention that there are 84 lakh of asanas, 8,400,000 or whatever that works out to be, an enormous number, an innumerable number. Basically, when they say 84 lakh, they're saying there's as many asanas
a lot of them
as there are stars in the sky, type of thing. But then they go on to teach only usually Padmasana or Siddhasana. So in many respects, the authors are acknowledging there's countless postures out there, countless asanas, but we really only need these couple of seated postures. It's with the Haṭhapradīpikā that situation changes, that all of a sudden more than just 2 or 3 seated poses become important for Hatha Yoga. And then after the Haṭhapradīpikā, it just grows, where we start to get collections of 32, then 84, 112 and that sort of number. And that really continues right through to the 20th century. And the reason that we talk about the history of Hatha Yoga and the Haṭhapradīpikā is because it seems from in that early modern period, from the 16th to the 18th century, that the word Hatha became a dominant paradigm for physical practice. And these other systems that particularly were in existence before the Haṭhapradīpikā, like the Sharanga system of the Viveka Martanda or the Ashtanga system of the Vasishta Samhita, these tend to, they still continue. You still get texts written on Sharanga and Ashtanga in the 16th, 17th and 18th century. But in terms of defining physical practice and the use of complex asanas, the sort of mudras that involve the bandhas, if you like, the word hatha was often used to describe that type of practice. And as you know, that then becomes contrasted against Raja Yoga, which is just the yoga of meditation, generally speaking.
I just want to backtrack a second and just ask you where the tantric element of yoga asana starts to come in and where you see that. You mentioned health reasons. Obviously, yoga, the original probably examples of asana were just holding one arm in the air or something, right? Or if they weren't for meditation, they were just ascetic, just kind of trying to, using tapas. And then at a certain point after the tapasya idea, the tantric stuff starts to come in, right? Using a kind of almost like a kind of body hacking to, and my qualification here is it always involved with kundalini as well? Does the tantric aspect always intent on the raising of kundalini up? Yeah, they're very good questions. I think there's definitely a paradigm shift with Tantra, and so a lot of the physical practices that we get in the first millennium are, as you say, sort of mortification of the body, standing or sitting for long periods of time, or even lying down. And there's even that element within Patanjali Yoga with the comments on tapas and how the body is to be viewed when talking about yama and niyama. There's a certain sense that the body is unhelpful or a problem. So that changes with Tantra undoubtedly, and I think also the understanding that internal energies could be manipulated for the purpose of achieving liberation, and that's also very important. That's really what the early Hatha techniques are trying to do. They're trying to manipulate prana, open up the central channel, sushumna, and bring about samadhi and liberation, by moving kundalini, prana, and agni, fire, up through the central channel, clearing any obstructions, the granthis, the knots, the knots, the chakras.